The movie opens with John Kramer undergoing a CT scan. After the scan, he inquires about the results from the technician, who explains that only a doctor can interpret the findings. The following day, John consults with his doctor, who delivers the grim news that he's very ill and should retire and rest due to his limited time left. Feeling despondent about his fate, John departs and takes a drink from a water fountain near a patient's room. While drinking, he observes a man pilfering from another patient's bed. The story advances as the thief is abducted and placed in a chair filled with traps and puzzles. Upon waking, he pleads for assistance, bewildered by the situation. John Kramer communicates with him regarding the theft, instructing him to adjust a control dial up to the 5th level, otherwise, a powerful vacuum will harm his eye. A 60-second countdown begins, and the man cries out for help. With no alternative, he turns the control dial to 1, resulting in the machine breaking his first finger, causing intense pain. The man continues turning the control dials one by one, screaming in agony. Unfortunately, his time runs out, and the vacuum gouges out his eyeballs. However, everything that unfolded exists only in his thoughts and not in reality. This illusion causes the man to stop robbing the patient and narrowly escape the horrific death he believed he was facing. John then goes to a cafe to write his last will and testament. While writing, he encounters Henry Kessler, one of the attendees from their support group. The two warmly greet each other with a hug, and Henry shares his experience of overcoming pancreatic cancer. Desperate to get better, John asks Henry about his recovery. Henry shows his surgical scar and informs John that he had undergone surgery with a specialist. He jots down the specialist's website on a tissue for John to look up. Henry bids farewell, expressing his support for John. Upon arriving home, John immediately starts searching for the specialist, Dr. Finn Peterson. He watches interviews and learns about Dr. Peterson's achievements. During his research, he comes across a video featuring Dr. Peterson's daughter, Cecilia Peterson, who expresses her commitment to continuing her father's work. John sends her an email, and after a while, he receives a call from Cecilia. They discuss the program, and they schedule the surgery for the following week in Mexico. The next week, John arrives at the airport, and a chaperone named Diego escorts him to Dr. Cecilia's office. However, while they are driving, a van suddenly blocks their path, and two masked men brandish guns. These men verify John's identity and, once convinced he is indeed John Kramer, they transport him to the entrance of a manor. There, he is greeted by Gabriella, who welcomes him and takes him to his room. Eventually, John meets Dr. Cecilia, and together they walk toward the facility where he will undergo the surgery. They arrive at the operating room, and Dr. Cecilia introduces John to the surgical team, informing him that they will perform his surgery the next day. Later that day, Dr. Cecilia and John have a conversation about their backgrounds, and John shares his career as a civil engineer and architect. On the day of John's surgery, he inquires about who will be performing the operation. Dr. Cecilia tells him that Dr. Ramon Cortez, one of the best surgeons, will be leading the procedure. During the surgery, John will be awake so that the medical team can monitor his abilities, and the doctor can make critical decisions during the procedure. John watches the monitor displaying his brain as the surgery commences. Eventually, he loses consciousness. When he wakes up in bed with bandages on his head, Dr. Cecilia visits him. She informs him that the surgery was successful and instructs him to take the painkillers in the fridge for the next 7 days. Overwhelmed with joy and relief, John sheds tears of gratitude. Dr. Cecilia shows John the results, which indicate that all his medical tests are normal, filling him with hope and aspirations. John continues to live a normal life, discarding the schematics of the death traps he used to draw and replacing them with architectural drawings. One day, filled with gratitude, John decides to visit Gabriella to give her some tequila, which is her favorite drink. However, when he arrives at the manor, everything seems different from usual. The front door is left open, and there are no people around. John goes downstairs and discovers an empty operating room filled with surgical props and books about neurosurgery. It dawns on him that everything was just a show, and the entire team was a scam. Furious about what has happened, John throws the bottle of tequila on the floor. One night, Diego, the man who had escorted John, was working his usual shift as a tour guide. As he prepared to start a new tour, a new passenger entered the vehicle. Before they even began the journey, this passenger covered Diego's nose and mouth with a cloth soaked in a sleeping drug. When Diego regained consciousness, he found his hands taped to a scalpel, and his body was tightly bound with a rope. Panicking, he attempted to free himself from these restraints, but in the process, he accidentally cut himself. During this struggle, he shouted for help, alerting John to his predicament. To his horror, a timer started ticking in Diego's hands, and an audio player fell from above, instructing him to remove the explosives attached to his arms by cutting his own flesh and muscles. After this distressing speech, the timer began counting down. Initially overwhelmed by panic, Diego eventually accepted the horrifying ordeal and decided to manually remove the bombs from his arms. In a display of immense courage and desperation, Diego successfully managed to remove the 2 bombs in time, but the skin and muscles of his arms were severely damaged in the process. After the explosion, John entered the room and handed Diego a first aid kit to tend to his wounds. Meanwhile, at a bar, Valentina, one of the scammers, connected with a guy. She insisted on going to a hotel room, but he wanted to have sex inside his car. When Valentina refused and tried to leave, the guy forcibly pushed her back into the car to assault her. Just as he was about to attack her, the window behind him suddenly shattered, and he was killed instantly. Valentina, in a state of shock, looked around in terror, and someone grabbed her from behind, kidnapping her. Simultaneously, Mateo, a veterinarian and another member of the group, was preparing to close their clinic when a strange pig-headed creature tasered him and captured him as well. On another note, Gabriella went to a club to work as a prostitute. Gabriella entered a cubicle and swallowed contraceptive pills. During this, she spotted a pair of shoes in front of the cubicle, which made her feel uneasy. She cautiously retrieved her pepper spray, stepped out of the cubicle, and found no one in sight. Little did she know, the pig-headed individual suddenly pushed the door into her face, knocking her down, and then sprayed pepper spray into her eyes. In the meantime, Dr. Cecilia, the mastermind behind the scam, was apprehended by John himself, who injected her with a sleeping drug in her neck. The other pig-headed person, Amanda, also revealed her true identity. The 4 of them eventually woke up, all restrained in their respective traps. When John entered the room, the others pleaded for his mercy, with the exception of Dr. Cecilia, who continued to deceive John. John began by explaining the nature of the traps, including a string-like blade that could cut through bones. He made it clear that he hadn't brought them for retribution but for a process of reawakening. In this horrifying scenario, John instructed Valentina to cut a part of his body to survive the test. Dr. Cecilia then urged Valentina to start sawing her own thighs as a means of surviving. Faced with no alternative and with the timer ticking, Valentina began to saw her thighs using a sharp string. She endured excruciating pain, making multiple attempts and screaming in agony. After enduring much suffering, Valentina managed to cut her thighs and collected blood from them using a large syringe. She came very close to completing the test, but unfortunately, the time ran out before she could finish. As a result, the saw in her neck activated, cutting her neck, and her head fell off. While Amanda and John were discussing who would be subjected to the test next, Dr. Cecilia devised a plan. She cut open Valentina's abdomen and used her intestines as a makeshift rope to retrieve her phone. In a daring attempt, she successfully retrieved her phone and immediately called someone for help. However, before she could disclose their location, Amanda apprehended her and pulled the chain around her neck, preventing her from conveying any information. Moments later, the call made by Cecilia reached Parker, one of the victims who had been deceived. Parker, now aware that Cecilia had tricked them, tried to break into the location to find her. He managed to locate an opening and, as he cautiously explored the area, he suddenly came face to face with a pig-headed figure. Startled and frightened by the appearance of the pig head, Parker instinctively fired multiple shots at it, only to discover that it was the lifeless body of Valentina. This gave Amanda an opportunity to strike him from behind. When Parker regained consciousness, he saw Amanda and angrily confronted her. John also entered the room, and Parker recognized him. Confused about the situation, Parker explained to John that he had tried to break in because he wanted to recover the money Cecilia had taken from him. John understood Parker's motives but needed him to make a significant choice before considering his release. John then instructed Amanda to prepare the elements for the next test. She went to the 3 captives, and Mateo was tasered to sleep. Amanda, after some time, finishes preparing the elements for the next test and places Mateo in a wheelchair-like trap. Jigsaw, the puppet, enters the room riding a bike, carrying surgical instruments and an audio player on top of his head. A camera is positioned on his upper head, and a monitor on his right side displays the view. Stitches can be seen on his upper head. Initially, Mateo refuses to start the audio player, but his head gets tased, leaving him with no choice but to activate the audio player. In this challenge, John has tasked him with acquiring a piece of his own brain to obtain the key. When the audio stops, the timer begins to tick, and Mateo panics. He grabs the drill in desperation to free himself from this dire situation. With immense pain and determination, Mateo uses the drill to open a part of his skull, exposing his brain. He then attempts to retrieve a piece of his brain using forceps, but the agony is almost unbearable. Seeing Valentina's lifeless body nearby, he summons the strength to successfully extract a piece of his brain and put it on the container. Unfortunately, Mateo's efforts to retrieve the piece of his brain prove to be in vain, as it needs to be dissolved before he can obtain the key. Tragically, it's too late for him. The trap in his head functions like a bread toaster, heating and squeezing his face and head. In the control room, John informs Amanda about his last will and testament. He asks her to be courageous and carry on with the work he started, acknowledging that his days are numbered. John entrusts Amanda with continuing his mission. Tearfully, they embrace each other. Returning to the test room, Gabriella is next in line. Initially, she refuses to start the audio player. John uses a microphone to convey the rules. Gabriella must break her own bones to free herself from the chains, or she will suffer burns and other adverse effects from excessive radiation. Gabriella is suspended at the top by the chains, enduring the intense heat from the radiator. Desperate to escape her dire predicament, she starts by breaking the bones in her feet. After multiple attempts, Gabriella successfully breaks her feet, freeing them from the chains. However, the radiator relentlessly follows her as she tries to get away. She continues to shatter her hands multiple times, ultimately breaking her wrists and collapsing to the ground. As John and Amanda are about to provide first aid to Gabriella, Parker manages to escape from his restraints. He grabs his gun, pointing it at John and Amanda, demanding they hand over the keys. Amanda complies, and it is revealed that Parker is not a victim or a patient but, in fact, Cecilia's boyfriend. He then instructs Amanda to release Cecilia, which she obediently does. However, Amanda doesn't miss the opportunity to slap Cecilia in the face. Parker and Cecilia agree to turn the tables on John and his assistant by placing them in the traps they devised. They instruct John and Amanda to take Gabriella to the hospital so she can survive. However, Cecilia declines, choosing to finish off Gabriella by kicking her in the nape. Just as they were about to begin retrieving the trap, they suddenly heard the sound of a ball hitting a wall. Cecilia, seeing a young boy playing by kicking a ball at the wall, conceives an idea. She brings the boy inside, but he becomes terrified upon seeing the dead bodies. Ignoring John's pleas not to involve the child in their punishment, Cecilia instructs Parker to chain the boy together with John in the trap. As they prepare to initiate the trap, John implores the boy in Mexico to pull the chain, which forces them down and places them in a horizontal position. Positioned before them, a faucet descends, dripping a relentless torrent of blood onto their faces, which flows into their mouths. The two of them begin to drown due to continuous flow of blood on their faces. In a desperate struggle for survival, John and the boy take turns pulling the lever to prevent drowning. The boy sacrifices himself by not pulling the lever, allowing John to rest, and this cycle continues. Ultimately, John chooses not to let the boy pull the lever anymore. Cecilia and Parker, confident about getting their money back, head to the control room, only to discover that the money is a trap, and the entrance is locked. Unbeknownst to them, the entire setup was premeditated. The faucets finally stop, and John and the boy manage to escape from their chains. While trapped inside, the other two attempt to escape by firing a gun at the door. To their dismay, the gun lacks gunpowder from the beginning, revealing that John knew their identities and merely pretended to be outplayed. A 10-minute countdown begins, signaling the release of deadly smoke into the room. This chemical smoke is fatal if breathed in. However, there's a way to survive. There's a hole through which they can stick their heads to avoid suffocation. As the clock ticks down, the true natures of Cecilia and Parker emerge, and they turn against each other in a fierce struggle to secure the survival spot. In this grim contest, Cecilia ultimately prevails over Parker, who has already inhaled the chemical and is weakened. Cecilia uses a sharp object to kill Parker. Although she secures the spot, Cecilia finds herself forever locked in the room filled with hazardous gases. Impressed by the bravery displayed by the child, John decides to bequeath the money to him. In the end, John, Amanda, and the child leave the facility. And the movie ends here. Cheers guys, thanks for watching.